And it's hitting.
It's out. And it's all over. Australia have won this game by 185 runs. They're all hugger-mugger out there. Delighted to have retained the Ashes. And what has been an extraordinary campaign. So well organised.
Hello everybody and welcome to a brand new episode of the One Stump Shot podcast. It's the Ashes 2019 wrap-up episode, time to dust off the mic and bring it out of retirement. To recap things, and I'm delighted to say on the line I have writer, broadcaster and one half of the phenomenal Final Word podcast. Adam Collins, welcome to the show. How are you? I suspect it revolves around the word knackered somehow.
It's a very kind intro. Yeah, it's been a grueling but thoroughly rewarding 4 months. I mean, I was thinking about it today when recording the Final Word with Jeff that it's slightly sad the end of a summer like this, because even though cricket isn't much of a sport for finish lines, and there'll be another summer soon enough and there'll be another tour soon enough and I'll be back at the cricket shortly, no doubt. There's an element of it's never going to get any better than this. Like the cricket might potentially, doubt it, but it might get better than this. There might be other better series individually, but having both the World Cup and the Ashes in 1 year, it's unlikely it'll happen again. And it's unlikely we'll have moments such as the Stokes miracle ×2, and I guess the history of Australia retaining the Ashes here after such a long period of time. All of that combined, and some of the individual performances, not least Jofra Archer kind of exploding onto the scene, the Stephen Smith Ashes campaign, which I'm sure will be talked about for 100 years or more. It's been special, and as a consequence, it's a bit sad today.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Australia retained the Ashes. The series finished 2-2. Back in Australia, how will this series be viewed? Is it a success because they retained the urn, or is it a bit of a disappointment because they did have that opportunity to win in England for the first time since 2001?
Look, I think you've got to put it in the perspective of where was Australian cricket 6 or 8 months ago when they lost to India at home 3-1, and it was a comprehensive thrashing as well on home soil, which doesn't happen too often to Australian teams. You can kind of count it on your fingers, one hand even, in the last 30 years how often Australia have lost at home. So that was a considerable moment. And of course Smith and Warner were returning to the 11 for this series, and they were always going to improve, especially with what we've seen from Smith. But so you take all that into consideration, and 2-2 and retaining the Ashes this year. I mean, consider the sides that have came to England in 2005 and 9 and 13 and 15 and not been successful, and the players that have been in those teams and who came to England time and time again and weren't able to go home with the trophy. They lost each of those series outright. To think that Australia have come here and achieved that primary objective is a considerable achievement. Now, not winning, of course, stings at the moment, but I don't think the history pages will judge them too harshly for that. It'll be more a frustration and a footnote and perhaps a bit of incentive for 4 years' time more than any major disappointment. They've got celebration activities in each of the 5 major Australian capital cities scheduled upon their return, and I'm sure they'll celebrate accordingly.
Do you think Australia are in a good place right now? Obviously, we mentioned Smith and Warner back. Maybe this series kind of capped off the whole thing with the sandpaper and Cape Town. Marnus Labuschagne's, it's been his summer, I think, what he's done with Glamorgan and now seemingly nailing down a place. They've got a 2020 series against Sri Lanka and Pakistan in October/November, so there's a bit of time off now, and then a couple of tests against Pakistan and New Zealand to cap off 2019. I mean, are things looking positive, do you think, for Australia as a team right now?
Yeah, to sort of pick one thing for what you said there, I think this does take sandpaper full circle. Not that you can ever erase what happened that fateful day at Newlands and the significant sort of knock-on effect, which included those year-long bans for their 2 best players. But it feels like we're almost back to a state of normalcy, to borrow a phrase from American 1950s culture. It does feel like this is kind of back to the state of where we were before sandpaper, and even just body language-wise, the way they carry themselves and the way they conducted themselves on the field at the Oval when they were a bit chippy. We haven't really seen much of that. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't want to get into a debate about the morality of sledging and so forth. But I haven't got any time for that. That's fucking boring. But what I would say is that, sorry, I just swore then. Am I allowed to swear in this podcast?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I don't give a shit.
But what I would say is that, to me, as an observer, it felt familiar. It felt more like the team from before, and that probably suggests that it's getting back to that stage. And you're right, it's always a full home summer, although I think this is not a bad summer for bringing some players in who might be outside the setup at the moment. If they want to have a look at a player like Will Pucovski, it's going to be a lot easier to do it on home soil against Pakistan and New Zealand than it is going to be perhaps in an Ashes series at home or against India is the other obvious high-profile blockbuster summer. This is the summers that isn't anywhere near as on Broadway, if you like. Now, that's sort of that's not said in a way to diminish Pakistan and New Zealand, but just historically the crowds aren't as big, the TV audience numbers aren't as big either. So, that you might see a little bit of that. But the other thing I'd note, and this is really important, and Justin Langer alluded to this yesterday when he did his sort of post-series debrief with us, is that the T20 World Cup is in Australia next year in October, and Australia have never won that trophy, and it's being played on home soil. So in the same way that England post-2015 invested heavily in the 50-over game, mindful that a World Cup was coming up on home soil, a trophy they'd never won, and of course we know what happened in July this year. I think there'll be a similar phenomenon going on in Australia in that they'll want to make sure they are fully equipped to do well there and present well there and give themselves a chance of winning that trophy, and that'll mean that they need to reorient their planning to the 20-over game, which hasn't always been the case at an international level. They've said themselves before that the way they've prepared for T20 series historically and major tournaments hasn't been ideal. It's always been like an add-on to 50-over cricket. So they've got a long lead time. They've got a lot of T20s in the calendar between now and next October. And I wrote yesterday that Justin Langer was taking briefings with senior players during the Derbyshire Tour game a couple of weeks ago, just 4 days after the Ben Stokes miracle at Headingley. So that gives a sense of, I guess, the spinning plates nature of the role as national coach. You don't get much of a chance to distinguish between Test and one-day and T20 cricket. You've got to be on the game with all three formats at all three times, whether it's being in the middle of an Ashes series whilst planning for a World Cup that's 18 months away. So I'd say that's something to keep a close eye on in the Australian summer, this T20 shift.
Yeah, do you think, because England are kind of at this point with Trevor Bayliss moving on, is it an advantage to have one coach like Langer or Bayliss as it was before, or do you think this is something that teams are going to start saying we'll split the role? We'll have a red ball coach for Test cricket and a white ball coach for ODIs and T20s.
Yeah, look, I think the one coach, two coach, three coach debate was going to be had in Australia last year, but Justin Langer made it pretty clear to the powers that be that he wanted to be overseeing all three formats of the game, and they were happy to acquiesce. Look, at different personalities are suited to different travel conditions and so forth. I think Langer, having been a full-time state coach, but before that the batting coach for the team across formats, he knows what it's like to be on the road outside of his own bed for 300 plus nights per year. This isn't unusual to him, so he's able to pull it off. But perhaps if you're looking at franchise coaches who are on the circuit, if they go from that kind of environment to an international gig, that they might not be as used to the rigours of non-stop travel and how it takes so much out of anyone, not just physically but emotionally as well. And that's where you might look at slicing and dicing and specialising a little bit more. But I don't think with Australia they were ever under any real doubt that Langer would want to do all three.
What about Tim Paine's future? Because he's retained the Ashes. That was really the I guess I don't want to say the minimum. That's maybe unfair, but he also came in at a very difficult time. There were expectations. There always are when it's Australia and England. He's maybe been honest to a fault at a point, especially after the Oval Test regarding reading pitches and things like that. But all in all, given what he inherited and where he is now, he seems to have done a decent job. Is he going to remain in the role, do you think, for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, definitely, for a few reasons. One is the absence of a serious alternative anyway. So even if Paine hadn't made a run this series and Australia had lost the Ashes and lost 5-0, I mean, sure, in those circumstances, extreme circumstance, he might have been under threat, under pressure, but that's not the case. He averaged 20, which you look at the series averages, that's not a disgrace. That's roughly what most specialist batsmen were averaging, and Tim Paine was always told by the coach Justin Langer that his primary job's to captain. His second job is to be the best wicketkeeper in the world, and his third job is to make valuable runs at number 7. I suppose you would say he did sort of 2.5 of those things in as far as he led Australia to their primary goal. He kept very nicely, with the exception of 2 moments, one at Old Trafford and one at the Oval, one where he dived across first slip and one where he didn't, which is, I guess, a judgment call in both cases, and he didn't make many handy runs, although he did make an important half-century alongside Stephen Smith at Manchester, and he did contribute to an important 50-run stand with Smith at Lord's. So, look, I think there's been a reflexive sort of response to pain from some people who don't watch Australian cricket as closely as others, who have said, well, you've got to get rid of this guy, he's no good, he's 34, he's not making runs the way that Adam Gilchrist did. But the next question obviously has to be, well, who's the Australian captain in November? It's going to be Payne. He's got more work left to do. I think that the fact that we now are operating on a World Test Championship cycle of 2 years, it's not just the 4-year Ashes cycle, which usually is what Australian and English cricket has been organised around in terms of red ball stuff. Now they've got the World Test Championship, which runs for 2 years, so maybe they'll see that as a more realistic time frame for Payne, and whether he can do the job for a couple of years, get Australia to that point, and by that stage they'll hope that the next captain has emerged, but they haven't as yet.
You've seen a lot of England, obviously, as well, over the summer with the World Cup and now the Ashes. I mean, there's got to be considered to be a pretty successful summer, the way, obviously winning the World Cup first and foremost, but the way it enraptured so many people. And then the Ashes again, it was 2 flawed teams arguably, but they produced some great cricket, as we mentioned off the top. And really, if you're England, you've got to be happy with the results you've had this year, right? Yeah,
well, that's how I've argued it. People have put that to me, that, you know, what would you rather, winning the World Cup or winning the Ashes? Like, to be honest with you, like, who cares? Like, the World Cup, like, these are all semantic arguments. The winning of the World Cup guaranteed that a whole generation of people were influenced by cricket at an important time in the summer. Now, whether that has the knock-on effect that the ECB and all cricket-loving people want, that will be seen going forward. But the architecture was laid down during the World Cup, and they went and won the bloody thing in spectacular circumstances on free-to-air television. Yeah. Winning or retaining or drawing or losing the Ashes, it'll be frustrating for England fans, especially given that it hasn't happened since 2001, where they haven't been the outright winner of an Ashes series at home. So yes, that will be annoying, and rightly so, and there'll be emphasis on the extent to which they planned for this compared to the emphasis that was put into the one-day World Cup, and that's a reasonable debate to be had as well. The scheduling, that Ireland Test match, who played, who didn't play there, who should have been laying on a beach, who was laying on a beach, and those sort of debates about man management too. But cricket in this country is healthier, considerably healthier for the summer of 2019, and that's a positive thing for anyone who loves the game. And debates around the success or otherwise of the national team, well, they'll always go on. That's the grind of the cricketing scheduling cycle. You're going to be up sometimes, you're going to be down sometimes, you're going to be the best team in the world sometimes, you're going to be fodder on other days. But the more important conversation is how the game's trending in terms of people watching it and engaging with it and playing it and being exposed to it. And on those metrics, it feels as though this summer is going to have had an effect which will be felt for some years into the future, in the same way that 2005 was.
Yeah, and I mean that's always been the comparison in England has been 2005 for obvious reasons. But yep. I think it was Ben Jones from CricViz made the point. We've now got a whole generation of people who are too young or not even born in 2005 to really appreciate it. It's just something they talk about. Like for us, Botham 81, Alan Border, for us, that was things that happened when we were kids, or not even born in the case of 81. Whereas we now have with the World Cup and these Ashes, again, they weren't perfect teams, but it made for better, more exciting cricket. You create a whole new raft of memories and heroes. You mentioned Archer, Stokes, Smith was brilliant, Cummins was brilliant. It's just been such a positive thing, I think, for this new generation of cricket fans.
Yeah, and if you're going to quibble, and it's more than quibbling, if you were to critique it, you would say that 2005 happened on free-to-air television, and it wasn't behind a paywall, which tends to preference privilege in terms of who has access to cable television. And of course, we all want to see more people watch cricket, and one big barrier to it is being able to see the thing on television. And look, I'm not going to sit here and lecture about that, being from Australia, and say that because we've always had it on free-to-air television and so on and so on. That's not what I mean, but that could be one area for improvement that hopefully they explore. I know the 100 is part of that conversation. Certainly the way the World Cup was set up this year, and I wrote a long feature with the ICC, well, embedded, if you like, with the ICC's World Cup organising committee before the World Cup started, and a lot of the conversations with them were about how much information they could ultimately supply to the ECB to give themselves the best possible opportunity of penetrating with the 100 when it starts next year. And again, the success or otherwise of that will be judged in due course. I think the 100's tricky because cricket people have reflexively not liked the idea. They feel as though it's tacky and unnecessarily tacky, and we already have formats which are suitably engaging. Certainly T20 cricket had that effect in Australia over the last 10 years. People forget that cricket was on the wane in Australia around 10 years ago. Certainly domestic cricket was well off the radar, and the Big Bash has had a big restorative effect on that, largely due to the fact that it's been on free-to-air television pretty much every night throughout the course of the Australian summer. So the one positive is that there'll be some games on the BBC. Not all, I should add. Not all at all. Not even close to all games, but at least some of them will be on there. And hopefully that sets a bit of a trend in motion where a sensible solution can be arrived at, where there is enough space in the cricketing broadcasting world where free and cable television can sit side by side and both options can be available the way that it is now in Australia and the way that it's been in South Africa for many years as well.
Adam, before I let you go, just one more question. I know you and Geoff Lemon have done upwards of like 100 shows on the final word during the summer. You mentioned World Cup, Women's Ashes, which we didn't even touch on there, Men's Ashes. Yeah. From all that, have you got any final thoughts from this summer?
Well, rather than do final thoughts, perhaps I'll give you what I consider to be the moment, the moments I'll never forget, and probably sitting out on its own is the World Cup final. There's the Jofra Archer and Ben Stokes moments from the Ashes, the Steve Smith century in both innings at Edgbaston, all very special events in and of their own right. And the Ben Stokes at Headingley is the greatest finish to a Test match ever, and there's a case that it's the greatest Test innings ever played. I mean, I don't want to diminish it, but the way that World Cup finished, scarcely believable circumstances. The fact that, I guess, from a personal perspective, that I was behind the microphone narrating that for radio as it was going on, so sort of having that personal link to an astonishing final stanza, and then the super over, and then the run out and all that went with it. That can never happen again. Almost, you think about the possibility that there'd be the tied World Cup final followed by the super over tied. All the various bits and bobs of that are so unlikely to ever happen again that I think that that was just so preposterous and so electric inside that ground. And I think that when I'm hopefully old and grey, that will be the one thing that stands out more than anything else. But it's a very competitive field, and as I said off the top, that's partly why it's so sad at the moment, I guess, from the perspective of looking back from a narrow distance now. I think with hindsight and with time, we'll be able to put it all in better perspective. But right now, it just feels like there's just going to be this gulf for a period of time, and there'll be a while where we're always referencing the summer of 2019 as a time where the game had this wonderful opportunity to influence so many people, and it did such a great job in doing so, and really dominate the national conversation at different points through the summer. And let's hope that's the start of something, not the end.
Adam, brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today. Enjoy the break, which you are very much earned and entitled to right now.
Thanks so much, mate. Hope it goes well.
Thanks again to Adam Collins for joining me today on the One Stump Shot podcast. You can follow him on Twitter @CollinsAdam, and if you aren't already a subscriber, I highly recommend you check out his podcast, The Final Word, that he does with Geoff Lemon. They've been putting in a huge shift over the summer. They've done podcasts after every World Cup game, after every day of the Ashes. There's 80, 100, whatever it is, podcasts. They've had some interviews with Pat Cummins, James Pattinson, among others. It's well worth checking out. One of the best cricket podcasts going right now. You can also follow me on Twitter @RobMcGrew35. You can find the One Stump Short blog at onestumpshort.wordpress.com. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/onestumpshort, and the email, strangely enough, onestumpshort@gmail.com. We've also got a Patreon and a Ko-fi, not sure how it's pronounced. We've got pages for both of those. If you just want to chip in and help out with the running of One Stump Short, we're all self-funded. It's not meant to sound like a begging thing. It's just there if you want to help out and support what we do. And that's kind of it. Thank you for listening. It's good to be back. Hopefully things will be a bit more regular now. I know it's odd to say that just at the end of the English summer season, but there's always a lot going on in the cricket world and plenty to discuss. So thanks again for listening today, and I hope to speak to you all again very soon.